Welcome to the Senior Moment. This is Connie Clark with Home Helpers. And this afternoon in the studio with me, I have Darryl Heisey, and he is the North Idaho State Veteran Services Officer for the top 4 counties of Idaho. And Darryl's been here with us before, and we've talked about all the different medical conditions that are associated with serving in the military. But there are so many, and when we talk and he speaks of each one of these, there's some very specific things about each one of these conditions. So I thought today what we would do is dive into those specific conditions and what conditions would generate a medical presumptive condition for a veteran and some of the things that are secondary issues to those conditions. So welcome, Darryl.
Well, it's good to be here, Connie.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
One of the things that you spoke to me in your office a couple of weeks ago when I was in there was we started talking about heart conditions. And yeah, you've said in here that ischemic heart disease is one of the conditions, and it went right over my head, and I went, okay, yeah, heart, what else? And I never really understood what that meant. So could you kind of go into details exactly what that means?
Well, sure. When we talk about presumptive conditions, obviously ischemic heart disease can be a regular service-connected disability for a veteran who served in the military. They were diagnosed with that in the service. That certainly is something that the VA does recognize. But when we talk about presumptive conditions, and today I think we'll touch base on some of the stuff from the Gulf War, some of the stuff from atomic testing in the Vietnam era veterans for presumptive conditions. There's very specific reasoning behind that presumptive, and this is for Agent Orange exposure, in particular for Vietnam veterans concerning the ischemic heart disease. And so I want to touch base a little bit about what kind of criteria does the VA use in order to determine whether a veteran is going to be able to receive compensation for a presumptive condition, such as ischemic heart disease, hairy cell leukemia, or Parkinson's. So one of the first things that is needed is they specifically say the veteran has to have served boots on ground during the wartime period of Vietnam. So that means their foot has to have been set foot in Vietnam physically, or they served in the Navy in brown water. That means river tributaries. A lot of the LSTs and some of the other landing craft, the VA recognizes as a service connected for presumptive because the exposure to the defoliant Agent Orange was pretty great. So when you're talking about 98 million gallons of this defoliant was used in Vietnam alone. And also this includes veterans who served in the demilitarized zone from like 69 to 70 in Korea on the demilitarized zone. So you're talking anybody that was in infantry in the Army potentially that were up in the DMZ during that time frame during Vietnam era can also be considered being exposed because you got a 300-yard swath that was basically cleared utilizing Agent Orange. So those veterans that served in those areas as well can also be looked at as
Korean veterans
Korean
also.
War, veterans who served in Korea during the Vietnam era from 68 to 71 around there.
And would that include those countries surrounding Vietnam also?
Well, there is also a small percentage of Air Force veterans who served in Thailand, and so if they can show that they were near or walked around the perimeter of their air bases in Thailand, and there's a number of different air bases in Thailand that fall under the presumptive of Agent Orange exposure. The VA is very specific as to who they are going to grant this to. I mean, it's not just something they're just going to hand out just because the veteran might have one of the conditions that's recognized as an Agent Orange presumptive.
They have to prove
that they, so a lot of it is aerial pictures. Where was their unit? Did they have some sort of proof or buddy statements from friends that say they were in around the area where they were spraying? Did they actually handle the defoliant? Some of the Navy ships actually brought it in. Some of the people flew it in. So there are some caveats to the presumptive conditions. So when we look at specifically, we wanted to kind of touch base on, ischemic heart disease and diabetes mellitus. When we talk about ischemic heart disease as a presumptive for Agent Orange exposure, what we're looking at is basically someone who has received a stent, someone who has a diagnosis of coronary artery disease, because basically ischemia is a blockage of the heart flow, blood flow to the heart. So what we're looking at there for those veterans is specifically when you were in service, were you boots on ground in Vietnam or brown water sailor? That's one of the first questions we usually ask our veterans who we're talking to that are referenced to this particular era of veterans. So specifically Vietnam. And then what we do from there is we have to obtain those medical records from their cardiologists who treated them. Maybe they have several stents. One of the interesting things about this particular condition is that under the Niemer law, this is a veteran who basically went under appeal to the Board of Veterans Appeals, and a couple of years ago he won his case where it was paying the claim back to when he had symptomology of this particular condition. What that means for some veterans is if they had applied for, let's say, ischemic heart disease or diabetes mellitus or prostate cancer or something like that in the past, back in the 80s, the VA, if they were to reopen that claim, the VA is obligated by the law to pay them back to that date, especially if they were denied. So that's a pretty interesting thing, because we've actually had veterans who've come into the office and said, "Is this correct? Look at this money, this $222,000, And I'm looking at it and go, "Yeah, it's going to be a great Christmas for you." I mean, literally, it's like that. And so that's that type of law put in place where a veteran had applied for the benefit, was denied, and then it just kind of was dead on the vine. But later on, they discover, oh, well, we under this new law, we have to pay it back to that date that they actually were denied the claim, or when there was a symptomology of the
That's
particular
interesting
condition.
because I have talked to veterans about this whole subject, and inevitably there's always one in there that says, oh, well, yeah, I tried filing 20 years ago and was denied, and I'm not even going to try. And so something like that, you might want to reconsider that, because things have changed quite a bit since then.
Yeah, and the VA has come a long way in the past. In the 70s, there was almost a really bad taste in a lot of veterans' mouths with the way they were being treated. Of course, the Vietnam era veterans welcomed them all home. That was a very, very rough time for those veterans in particular. They were ashamed to wear their uniforms, or they would be, sped upon. Things of this nature that took place. It's kind of a black eye, I believe, on our nation. But we can rectify that by thanking and welcoming them home when we run into them, because a lot of times I run into a Vietnam vet and thank them for their service, and I'll welcome them home, and a tear will well up, and I'll say, "What's going on?" He says, "Well, you're the first person that ever told me welcome home." And then I think, how can that be? Then we're 30 plus years, almost 40 plus years from that conflict, and yet I'm the first one. So it's a privilege, really, for us to service the veteran population here in the northern Idaho, in helping them with these claims. And the other thing that's really important here too is if the veteran passed away from these particular conditions, his surviving spouse might be out there, and he or she may be entitled to benefits under dependency indemnity compensation. Now, that's a pretty huge benefit because it's a tax-free benefit that's paid to the surviving spouse of a veteran who died from a service-connected condition. In this case, if the death certificate or that particular individual was a Vietnam veteran, and he or she served in Vietnam, boots on ground, and they died from, let's say, prostate cancer or lung cancer
or a heart attack,
or a coronary artery disease, they can open up a claim for that particular disability for what we call dependency indemnity compensation, and the VA will look at all of the evidence, and then they'll come to a decision. And a lot of times it's in the favor of the surviving spouse, especially if the death certificate certainly says one of the presumptive conditions is on there.
And the spouse that passed away does not have to have an active claim with the VA, correct?
No, they don't have to. In fact, this would be a new claim for the surviving spouse. And I like doing those because what we do really literally changes people's lives. So whether we're talking about the non-service connected pension or we're talking about service connected disabilities, in particular, we're talking about presumptive conditions, ischemic heart disease right now. But if they came into the office, our staff is pretty well versed in asking particular questions and drilling down to be able to help that individual determine whether or not they might have a claim. And we think that, if we believe that they have a good claim, we'll file it. If they believe they have a good claim, we'll file it. I mean, it's their claim, and we're here to help them with that process. So, it's one of those things where when we start looking at presumptive conditions, one of the other ones that we talked about, ischemic heart disease, is very particular. It's very specific. Coronary artery disease, if you have the diagnosis, you can file a claim for that. And here again, we're talking about certain areas of service and certain times. So just because somebody served and they have ischemic heart disease,
right,
it doesn't necessarily apply to them. So
right. And the other thing is diabetes.
Right.
That's something that has not been going on for a long period of time. That was like 10 years ago, I believe, when they determined that diabetes could be associated with Agent Orange. And I know that when someone has diabetes, depending on what their treatment is, the extent of the treatment that they have to do, that increases the percentages that they get for having that disease, correct?
Correct. Yeah, and diabetes is another presumptive for Agent Orange exposure. And veterans as well may have been diagnosed with diabetes in the service. And I'll give you a true example. I had a retiree from the Navy, and I was looking through his military medical records. About midway through, I noticed he had a diagnosis of diabetes in his military active duty file, but nobody had told him. And so when he came into my office, I filed a regular claim under not under presumptive, but under direct, because he was diagnosed with diabetes. No one had ever told him that. And then now, of course, he's going through all of the process of the current diabetes. But the VA rates diabetes with a 10% rating, a 20% rating, 40%, and it can go up to 100 depending upon what are the factors behind it. But I want to talk specifically about what are the secondary causes of diabetes. Here again, we're talking about someone who has been diagnosed with diabetes under presumption of Agent Orange exposure, and how does the VA rate that as far as a disability? So if a veteran has a diagnosis of diabetes and he or she is controlling it by diet, that percentage is 10%. It's about $129 a month. But the minute they go on metformin or some other medications, insulin, something like that, the income, that percentage of compensation goes up to 20%. It's around $225 a month. So when we look at the diabetes, there are secondary issues. And VA will recognize secondary conditions that are caused from diabetes mellitus. So when we look at that, some of the things we're going to be asking are, do you have any of the following problems? Do you have coronary artery disease? Oh, by the way, that's ischemia, so of the heart. So that's also something that could be caused secondary to diabetes. Upper and lower peripheral neuropathy. Those are the numbness in the hands and the tingling, things of that nature, where it kind of feels like it's falling asleep, but that happens when they're just walking or they're sitting or they're, whatever. So those are things that are recognized. Diabetic neuropathy is part of that. So veterans have been diagnosed with those issues, and depending upon how severe it is, they get compensated because of that. Foot onychocomososis, which is basically, it's kind of like a reddening. It kind of looks like the calf has got this red splotchy stuff on it. So that's kind of what you're looking for. They do also pay a special monthly comp for erectile dysfunctions secondary to diabetes mellitus. And keep in mind, too, that when we start talking about secondary issues, these are things that doctors are treating, and they're stating it basically that as there's a 50-50 chance that these secondary conditions are caused from the diabetes mellitus. So we're talking, the radiculopathy, neuropathy. We're also talking renal disease as part of secondary for diabetes mellitus.
So if you have it and you start coming down with all of these different conditions, go and refile.
Oh, yeah, definitely. In
Because
fact,
it's not an automatic thing.
no, it's not. They're not going to. I mean, you can actually be treated at the VA medical center for these conditions secondary to diabetes, and no one will tell you at the VA to file a claim because that's not their job. Their job is to treat the veteran and give them the best treatment in the world. But their job is not to help them with a claim. That's where service officers across the United States, in particular the Kootenai County area, Bonners, Boundary, and Shoshone counties, and every county in Idaho has a service officer, or we have a state service rep that actually goes into those areas and helps people file for these types of claims. Diabetic retinopathy, and we're talking about the eyes, cataracts, glaucoma. These are also issues that are linked directly to diabetes because we're talking about a system of the body that's being affected because of the diabetes. It's like a guy, let's say, for instance, he has an issue with poor healing. Maybe he stubs his toe, breaks his foot, breaks his toe on the bottom, and then somehow there becomes a sore. And it doesn't heal up, and it becomes gangrenous. Now he gets that foot cut. Well, okay, the toe's cut off. Now they're cutting the toe. Now they're cutting off another toe, and all of those things are because of the diabetes. The VA recognizes that loss of use of that particular, let's say, if he loses his foot or his leg, the VA then pays him or her, depending upon who it is, for that loss of that particular limb. And so that's right. Why it's really important to keep up on your medical stuff that you're going to the doctor, because no one really takes care of you unless you talk to the doc. The doctor's not going to know what's going on with you. They can do blood tests, and yes, they can find some things out that way. But a lot of times the symptoms of what's going on with you need to be addressed. So we always tell our veterans that when you're in the VA system or talking to your physician, your private physician, make sure that you're telling them and talking to them about what's going on with you at home. How difficult is it? Are you losing strength in your arms? Are you losing strength in your legs? And then ask the question, is that because of my diabetes? And very often, almost all of those times, if they have a case of diabetes, the doctors are going to link that medically, and then you can file a claim under secondary cause and effect to the VA, and we'd be glad to help veterans with that.
Yeah, I think that's really important because I've, again, talked to a number of veterans who I've talked to. They say, oh, yeah, well, we're getting disability. I ask what percentage they're at, and they're at a low percent, yet they have all these secondary things going on with them. And they just assume somehow that someone's going to know that this is happening, and if they were entitled to something more, then they would get it. But they really have to actively initiate that.
You bet. You bet. Even, like, let's say, for instance, let's talk a little bit about prostate cancer. Prostate cancer is a pretty common cancer in men. Over 50, it's usually kind of where it happens. But also, prostate cancer has been recognized as a presumptive of Agent Orange exposure. And here again, we're talking about a condition that can kill potentially. So here, what we do is we get the veteran file a claim for prostate cancer. They have the diagnosis. They're going for treatment, and then they're going to remove the prostate itself. So in that process, they get rated 100% service connected. Now, they put their lives on the line, so this is the least we can do for them, right? So
absolutely.
100% is not a big deal, especially when you consider they could lose their life. So
right.
Here we go. We have 1 year at 100%. At the end of that year, the VA reevaluates that veteran based upon residuals of the prostate removal. And here again, we're talking about incontinent issues. We're talking about erectile dysfunction and things of that nature. So the disability drops based upon where is that veteran's health at currently at that time. The VA just doesn't give money away to anybody. They have to base it upon the law and what does the medical evidence show. So if a veteran is using 4 or 5 pads or 6 to 7 pads a day in a 24-hour period, they're going to keep him rated at 60% versus 30% or versus 10%, where a guy who maybe he did radiation treatments with seed and he doesn't have any issues related to that. And so they're going to pay him potentially at 0% for that prostate cancer.
Okay, that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
All right, I need to take a break, but I want to continue talking because every time I talk to you, I learn so much. So we will be right back. things associated with the Gulf War.
Sure.
That's something I don't know a whole lot about. Okay, you ready?
Yep. Let's do it.
And we're back. Again, this is Connie Clark with Home Helpers, and I have Darryl Heisey, our state service office, veteran service officer here. And the first part of the program, we were talking about medical conditions associated with Agent Orange, but a couple of times Darryl mentioned Gulf War veterans. And I'm not really very familiar with some of those conditions. So talk about those. What kind of conditions are associated with being in the Gulf War, and is that through people in Afghanistan right now and that whole situation?
Well, great. I just want to read some of this information. It comes right off of the Department of Veterans Affairs. It talks about presumptive conditions. There is now a Gulf War registry that is going to be starting. So any veteran who served in Southwest Asia Theater of Operations during Gulf War and currently serving, they can put their name on this list because they are conceding that there are some conditions that we don't really quite know what our men and women got into over there, but they're sick. And so the VA is recognizing that. It took them only 10 years to get to this point, really. And now, unlike the Vietnam era, where it almost took 30 years for them to recognize
we're cutting down
this.
that time frame. Okay.
Yeah, and I think a lot of it has to do with the Vietnam vets who, were basically up front and just saying, this isn't right.
Very vocal
and don't let this happen again to our vets. And so these new kids that are coming back from serving are basically, we're talking about post 9/11, and so the Gulf War veterans' undiagnosed illnesses. This is a very interesting thing. What we're talking about is an onset of 6 months. If they have they're being treated for 6 months for any of the things we're going to be talking about, and they can't figure it out. The VA will at that point consider that an undiagnosed illness. So some of the things we're talking about is chronic fatigue syndrome. And here, this is kind of where the individual feels like he got a good night's rest, but gets up and he's just tired all day long, has no energy, and it's chronic in its nature, very fatigued, and that's why they call it a chronic fatigue syndrome. We're not really quite sure what causes it, but these are basically clusters. The VA says. Medically unexplained chronic multi-symptom illnesses defined by a cluster of signs or symptoms that have existed for 6 months or more, and such as chronic fatigue syndrome, fibromyalgia, irritable bowel syndrome, any diagnosed or undiagnosed illness that the Secretary of the Veterans Affairs determines warrants a presumptive of service connection. So what we're looking at here is this is not an all-inclusive list. Some of our guys, they have joint pain, just undiagnosed joint pain. It's just all over their body. They just are in pain. I have guys who have filed claims for that, and they've won those claims because they've had this onset of this stuff going on ever since they came back from the first Gulf War. And here again, we don't know what's causing this issue, but it's different. Let's say, for instance, somebody hurt their neck, their cervical neck, and they have pain there in their neck. Well, and they go, well, you have a degenerative disc issue. Well, that's not a presumptive because they know what it is. You injured yourself in the neck, so that really doesn't fall under the presumptive.
So it's something they can't diagnose to a specific condition.
Exactly. They don't know what's caused it. There's no specific ideology. They have no idea when what happened. All they know is that individual served in the area. And oh, by the way, this also includes people who flew over these areas, because you got to remember we're talking about intakes on aircraft. We're talking about smoke in the air, burning of all sorts of things, chemicals and oils and things of that nature. So that also applies for any veteran who was flying over these areas. So anyone who was in those areas of operation should be able to put their name on the registry, be registered at the VA Medical Center, and that registry is built on every year. There's more and more things that will probably be added. As it's stated here, that the Secretary of the VA is the one that can also add more things to this list. And also in the regulation, the 38 Code of Federal Regulation, they mention these things, but then they say this is not all inclusive. It could be other things that a doctor says, you know what, I believe it's because of the Gulf War. stuff that you were exposed to over there.
And this is a little, at least for me, it's a little harder for me to grasp because when I look at the list for Agent Orange, it's got very specific medical conditions, and that's a diagnosed condition. But when you look at this, it's just this whole lump of things. But they still need to make sure that they go to a doctor and tell the doctor, I'm feeling joint pain all over, or I've had these massive headaches and I can't get rid of them. That has to be documented somewhere that you actually told a doctor and they weren't able to figure out what was causing it.
Yeah,
is that correct?
Literally, it's a 6-month. There's a 6-month process there, and then they just we have no idea. You have joint pain. I think you have fibromyalgia. Well, here again, they don't know. That's kind of ambiguous in its diagnosis, but that's one of the conditions that the VA recognizes for the Gulf War undiagnosed illness list. Signs and symptoms of undiagnosed illnesses include the fatigue, skin symptoms, headaches, muscle pain, joint pain, neurological symptoms, respiratory symptoms, sleep disturbance, GI symptoms, cardiovascular symptoms, weight loss, menstrual disorders, and the list can go on and on. But at this point, it's kind of really important that the veterans know that these conditions can be recognized by the VA, and they can get service connected. I'll give you a true story. Had a veteran come into my office, a retired Navy veteran, a really nice guy. He's got 3 kids and he's married, and he's in this process of he's had all of these symptoms. I started reading these symptoms to him, and he was going, "That's me, that's me." And I told him, I says, "Well, how long have you been going to the doctor for this?" He says, "Ever since I got out of the service, when I retired in 2005. I said, "Well, you know what? I think you have a chance to make a claim for undiagnosed conditions because you've been getting these treatments." And he had the weight loss, he has the irritable bowel issues, he has a chronic fatigue syndrome, he has all of these things. And when I started telling him about how the VA rates these disabilities, he literally almost broke down in my office as realizing there's actually help for him. So when we look at these issues, we're gonna take a look at everything for the veteran. We're going to look into all of these issues. We're going to file the claim as expeditiously as we can, knowing that the VA takes about almost a year now to file for a regular service-connected disability claim. And there are instances where they will actually walk the claim through if the veteran is terminal, or the veteran is in really dire financial straits. But it has to be really dire for them to do anything different. But the Gulf War veterans they now have on the VA website. It's www.va.gov. They actually have where you can sign up right there. There's actually an examination they will give the veteran to determine if he or she has any of these issues, and then they can get their treatment. Keeping in mind that the ladies and gentlemen who are serving currently in our armed forces, and when they get out of the service, the VA says that if they served in Southwest Asia, that they're entitled to 5 years, up to 5 years of free health care for those conditions. Well, obviously, if they become service connected, that health care is for life. So it's a big deal, especially with the medical issues that we've got going on in our nation today. Having good health care for our veterans is a must. And so just wanted people to be aware that Gulf War registry is out there. They get their name on it, get the examination, and just keep up with what's going on. The key here for us is going to be how is this going to affect our veterans? Well, it's going to let them know that somebody cares. And when our nation does something like this, that does show that they are trying to take care of our veterans. So I'm very pleased with what the VA has done with this Gulf War registry. In fact, if you look at a lot of the VFWs, American Legions, and other organizations, national organizations, they're really thanking the VA for the work that they've done on this process.
And I think you had brought up earlier the fact that just because you are going to the VA hospital for this condition, don't think that those doctors and nurses that you're talking to are automatically going to bring up the fact that you need to go and investigate for a claim because they're not. That's not their job. They
That's
don't
right.
know all those specifics.
That's right. Yeah, a veteran service officer is trained in the law. They understand the types of forms that are needed. Now, granted, a veteran can also use e-benefits, and that's the new thing that the VA is going to in October of this past year, in 2012. The VA decided they were going to go paperless, and this is a kind of a growing pains for everybody. But what they're doing is they're taking all of the hard copy files and they're sending them to certain areas within the United States. In our area, it's Wisconsin, and there's a company that all they're doing is scanning documents, making them where the VA can actually utilize them in a PDF format. And I don't even know if they're using PDF, but I'm just saying that's kind of
type,
that type of thing. So that's going to add a little bit of time to the claims process, but that's okay because once you get to a paperless situation, that's why a veteran can file for a claim online. The only problem with that sometimes that I see is just what do they do with the responses? How do they respond to the VA? What is the VA asking for? I've already sent them the medical records. Why are they asking for that again? You have to remember that there's been a lot of veterans who have filed claims, a lot of veterans who were denied, and then veterans went into an appeals process. And here, that's where a lot of the law kind of gets thrown in there at the vet. I'm not saying that the veteran can't understand what the VA is trying to say, but it sure makes it a lot easier when you have a service officer you can go to. He takes that piece of paper, he says, sign here, do you have anything else to give? And then submits it. And you're just like, wow, that was easy. And that's really what our office does over here at in Post Falls.
And those denial letters, they not only say you're denied, but they also tell you what you need to do in order to get approved.
That's right. The VA is not hiding anything from the veteran.
It's not like taking a test and they're not going to tell you the right answer.
Yeah, they're going to tell you they've looked at the evidence. They're going to say, hey, this particular piece is missing, but if you get somebody to link it, they'll tell you that. But those are things that if you're trying to do it on your own, you're not going to catch that. But the VA does clearly on their decisions, all of them, they'll tell you all of the evidence that was used, and then they will look at it and they'll say, after careful and compassionate review of your file, this is what we've determined. So for when veterans come in here with a decision, the veteran might be mad about something. By the time we get done explaining what's going on with why the VA made the decision they made, we then have a couple of courses of action. The veteran can obviously appeal it. He can just say, let it go. Or he can say, you know what, the VA was compassionate. I don't have that medical. They do have me rated appropriately. So that more often than not, that's what we get. It's just they don't understand the process. But when we're able to help them wade through that, and if they want to appeal it, we'll be glad to help them do that as well.
Well, and again, it tells them that they're not at that point. But once you get to this point, like you said, you were denied because you weren't to this point and this is what you need. If you eventually get to that, you come back and appeal again because now you have what they need.
Yeah, and the VA usually gives you up to 1 year from the date of the original claim. And sometimes there's a long period before they actually answer your notice of disagreement, and we're getting into the woods, into the bushes a little bit with that kind of stuff. But if a veteran is out there and he's filed a claim or she's filed a claim and they got a result and they just they throw their hands up in the air and they just go, I don't want to mess with this, we strongly recommend that they go and talk with a service officer and ask them what do they think they should do, because 9 times out of 10 we're going to be able to give them some good advice. We're going to empower them because we have a lot of knowledge in this area of filing claims and those kinds of things. And so we want to do one of the mottos for service officers: do no harm. So we certainly don't want to send the veteran down the wrong path. We want to say, hey, you're lacking this medical evidence. Go get that from your doctor. And they'll do that. And those veterans who listen to that and then apply what we've told them, and then we reapply or we open to something, they do very well on their claims. You have to remember, too, that over $88 million in the 4 northern counties was brought back in 2011 through the work of service officers. And so you think, wow, that's a lot of money. Well, that's all of the expenditures that come back through the work done for veterans who are using the VA hospital, for veterans who are buying a home, for veterans who are using educational benefits, for veterans who are on a pension because their income is so low, for veterans who are service connected. So when you start looking at that money coming back to our county and coming back to our state, you have to go, wow, that's a lot of money, and it's all tax-free to the veteran. So he or she does not have to worry about paying taxes on that. That's something that's really exciting about those particular expenditures that are brought back into our counties.
Well, and I wanted to, I guess, force that issue because, again, I hear a lot of people that give up, and I don't want them to give up. And if you were denied 20 years ago, come back and talk to a veteran service officer. It might be the case, like you said, that things have changed.
That's right.
But it really, it aggravates me when I talk to people that have given up. And they shouldn't give up because they deserve these benefits and they need to really pursue them. One of the other things you mentioned was the atomic exposure. What is all that?
Well, going way back to Hiroshima and Nagasaki, when we bombed Japan, there was atomic testing that was being done in Nevada and other states, and done in the out in the ocean with Navy ships taking part in that. We had Marines that were taking part in Nevada. Literally, they would see the atomic bomb drop, and they had all their gear at the ground zero, and they're only about 3 miles away, and they're just wearing their regular uniforms, and they've got these little tabs that are on their uniforms. It kind of catches the radiation, so to speak. They see the bomb dropping, and then they say, okay, cover your eyes. And then the bomb blows up, and the dust is coming, and they feel this heat rush 3 times, whoosh, whoosh, whoosh. And then they go, all right, load up in the trucks, guys, here we go. So they load up in their trucks, and they drive down there to ground zero, pick up their gear, and the guy's got these little gaggers going, and then they say, give me your tag, and they throw it into a box, and that's the last scene you see of it. The guys get their gear, and they throw it on, and off they go. 60 years later, they come up with some sort of condition like leukemia. And then the VA says, well, we recognize that if you took part in any of the atomic testing. You remember there were some years where they did 57 tests in 1 year, and this was over a
I didn't
long.
know that.
Oh yeah, this is over a long period of time. And in fact, if you were to do some research on the internet about military atomic testing, America is not, they're not hiding anything. It's out there on the internet. You can read about it, you can see it, and it even talks about the units that actually took part. If a veteran took part in any of this atomic testing and he or she has any of these issues, the VA will recognize that and as an issue that maybe, we're going to give the benefit of the doubt to the veteran. So they say basically what we're looking at here is participate in atmospheric nuclear testing, occupied or was a POW in Hiroshima or Nagasaki, service before 1992, at a diffusion plant at Paddock, Kentucky, Portsmouth, Ohio, or Oak Ridge, Tennessee, or service before 174 at Amachitka Island, Alaska. And like I said, there's Nevada is also in here where they did a lot of testing in Nevada. So a lot of our veterans who were part of those tests, the Marines and the Army and other military members, can file if they have these conditions. One of them is all forms of leukemia except for chronic lymphocytic leukemia. And then it says cancer of the thyroid, the breast, pharynx, the esophagus, the stomach, the small intestine, and pancreas, bile ducts, gallbladders. Yeah, I could go on and on. But then there's other things here that we're looking at: lymphomas, Hodgkin's disease, liver cancer. And these are all things of the atomic. A lot of times a guy will come in and he's a World War II veteran and he took part in one of these tests, or he was whatever, in a certain area. But he's perfectly healthy. He doesn't have any leukemia, but he wants to file a claim. Our job as a service officer is just to let him know that if he gets diagnosed with any of these issues, or if he died from one of these issues, here again, we're talking about a surviving spouse of the veteran. if that veteran took part in that, and she or he can prove that that veteran served during that time frame, and it's one of the things on the death certificate is one of these presumptive conditions, we strongly encourage them to file or come to the office and at least ask the question, is it possible that we might be entitled to some dependency indemnity compensation? Here again, this benefit is for a veteran who died from a service-connected condition. It's a survivor benefit. It's unlike the widow's pension, we call the widow's pension or improved death pension. It pays at a much higher rate, and it's a good benefit because it also entitles them to CHAMP VA health care, military ID card. I mean, it opens up a whole new world to the surviving spouse.
I want to continue talking about that because there's some other things you told me about that also. But we need to take a break. I just love talking to you. I learned so much. So we will be right back. I want to talk about the DIC and then if someone, instead of the aid and attendance, that it would be the extra. And then I want to bring up PTSD.
Okay.
Are you ready? And we're back at the senior moment. Again, this is Connie Clark with Home Helpers, and I have Darryl Heisey. He's our North Idaho State Veteran Service Officer. And we started talking about it right before the break, but I want to continue talking about the widow and widowers DIC compensation. So if a spouse dies from a condition that he or she got as a result of their military service, their spouse is entitled to compensation. And what is that and how is that determined? Because I remember my mother doing this. My father was actually her second husband. Her first husband died in World War II, and he was killed in action. She got DIC, and then when she married my father, that stopped. And 50 plus years later, when my father passed away, she was able to go back and refile on her first husband and receive that and get the insurance. And I don't think a lot of people know that.
Right, and keep in mind too that there's two different types of DIC is actually compensation that's paid to the surviving spouse of a veteran who died from a service-connected condition, and there are some certain criteria for that, but the death certificate is basically what the VA will go off of to determine was it something that the veteran had. Like here, we'll use the leukemia from atomic testing. Okay, the veteran dies from the leukemia from the atomic testing, and then his surviving spouse is now entitled to DIC, which is known as dependency indemnity compensation. And this particular benefit pays at $1,195, maybe slightly more this year. It did go up slightly. Or if they're, and also we take into consideration whether or not they're housebound or they need regular aid and attendance. If they meet that criteria when they apply for the benefit, the VA will pay that benefit, and it's around almost $1,500 a month. And that's a tax-free benefit to the surviving spouse.
And that's if they need help with activities of daily living and that sort of thing.
Home helpers, yeah, you bet.
They can't stay home on their own.
You bet.
And they could even be in an assisted living or something like that.
Absolutely.
Correct?
It does not affect their Social Security. It doesn't affect any pensions they might have. Mm-hmm. This is the benefit that's paid to them because their spouse, the veteran, died from a service-connected disability. And dependency indemnity compensation is like you said, like your mother. She was married to a vet. He passed away in the service. She received this benefit. She married, and then that person died, and now she's able to get back onto that benefit because it still carries based upon the first veteran that she was married to. And I've seen that scenario played out many times here in our area as well. So it's a great benefit. I like doing it because it really, again, we're changing people's lives. And this benefit pays at a higher rate than, let's say, the widow's pension potentially would, what we call improved death pension. That's a little bit different benefit because that's based upon the income of the individual. Wartime period of service is needed at least one day during a wartime period. Doesn't mean that the veteran served in war, but served during the time of war. And there's a lot of different times of war that we've got going on. World War II, December 7th, 1941 to July of 1947. And then Korea, 1950 to 1955, Vietnam era veterans 64 to 75, Gulf War vets to present, 1990 to present. So those are the periods of war that are recognized by the VA. So if a veteran, their surviving spouse comes into our office and her income is, let's say, $450 a month, well, she is way below the income threshold set forth by law. By Congress sets that every year. And then we can also add a little bit more money to that if they're in need of regular aid and attendance or they're housebound. Now let me kind of define those a little bit for you so you have an idea. Housebound means they're dependent upon people to drive them to the groceries, drive them to the doctors, but they can still manage inside the home. So that's kind of what we look at as housebound. A physical examination is done by a physician that determines, yes, they are housebound. They could be blind and they need aid and attendance. That automatically qualifies them. If they're dementia, Alzheimer diagnosis, that automatically qualifies them for aid and attendance. If they need help getting out of bed, if they need help bathing, those kind of things, that's really when the person falls into an aid and attendance benefit. And the monetary or the annual incomes for a surviving spouse who is perfectly healthy is kind of ridiculously low, but it's $8,359. Literally, I have surviving spouses who make less than that, and it's a joy to be able to help them. But majority of them fall into what we call a housebound status, and then the income level for them is $10,217 per year. And then aid and attendance without children, it goes up to $13,362 per year. Keeping in mind that if they're using home helpers or if they're in assisted living, their income is going to be very little. If they go onto let's say Medicaid, the pension is not going to help them. In fact, it could harm them.
It'll knock them off Medicaid.
Yeah, it would knock them off Medicaid. And in that event, you'd probably want to make sure that, hey, I don't want to do any harm here, so your best bet is to stick with Medicaid. This is for the surviving spouse, particularly for the improved death pension. But if their income is, if we're talking a couple $100 a month that they could get, to offset their out-of-pocket medical expenses, basically, just like the Social Security, the VA pays everything in arrears as well. So they're going to base off of last year's income and last year's out-of-pocket medical expenses for this, what we call the improved death pension. A lot of people call it the widow's pension for the VA. There's a lot of people out there in social services, home helpers, and other areas that are in homes, and they're talking to people, and they're making a difference in people's lives. So I just wanted to make sure that we know that if there is a question, these people, and we're talking specifically about Connie's home helpers, they're in the homes. They understand this procedure. They call us. It's, hey, Darryl, or Scott, can you come over and can you take a look at these
we're always
folks?
On the phone with you all.
You bet.
And one of the things I want to point out that we have seen in our community where different persons have come in and done presentations saying that they would help someone to get this aid and attendance pension. And one of the problems with that is that person is going to specifically try to get them that pension. But like what we've been talking about, there's a whole lot of other benefits that someone could be entitled to that would actually be more beneficial for them. And when you're going in and hearing a presentation of someone who says that they're going to get you money for this aid and attendance pension, what I would really suggest to you is to go talk to a veteran service officer, because they're not only going to look at that as a possibility, but there's the DIC, there's the disability, there's a whole lot of other different things that you could qualify for.
That's right.
And it would really be a shame if you would only apply for the one thing and not actually apply for other things that you qualify for that could make it a whole lot simpler and easier for you.
You bet. Yeah, and there's also, and we're talking about the widow or survivor benefits, but there's also the non-service connected pension. We kind of talked about that at length the last time we were on the radio. But one of the things that I want to be real clear about is when a person is going to file for VA benefits, there should be no cost attached to that at all.
And that's illegal, correct?
It's illegal to charge somebody. It's a federal offense, basically, if you do that. So if there's somebody that's potentially charging someone to file for this claims, that's why at every county the counties are supposed to provide assistance in filing of claims. And that's the job. That's a free service that's provided to our tax-paying dollars pay for that. Well, it's to protect the veteran and her surviving spouse because they are vulnerable. And so our jobs as service officers, veteran service officers, is to kind of bridge a gap between the individual and the VA. We're advocates for those veterans. We do not charge anything for our services. We get paid by the state or we get paid by the county, and we do it gladly. And all of us, our service officers, are veterans, so we understand service, we understand duty, we understand honor, we understand all of that. And that's where when you start to look at claims, I'm going to look at every aspect of that veteran, anything that I can help that veteran with as a service officer. If I can help them, I will go down that road and I will plow that road for that person. So that's kind of the difference between having somebody who's an advocate than somebody who's trying to hide some of your money for you. See what I'm saying?
And where I can think of that happening is you've got a widow going in saying, I really need assistance. I can't do things on my own. My husband passed away. And if they were to talk to one of these other people, they'd immediately try to get them the widow's pension. But after talking to you, they find out that he was a Vietnam veteran. He was boots on ground. He had a massive heart attack. He had stints, 10 years ago. And now you're talking a whole nother area.
That's right.
Of something that widow could be entitled to.
And the amounts of money are far greater, and it's not based, the DIC, Dependency Indemnity Compensation, is not based upon the income of the individual.
Right, that has nothing to do with it.
Whereas the pension, the widow's pension or the improved death pension, is based upon income and based upon wartime period of service.
And they don't have to worry that, well, my husband never did file a claim with the VA. That's not an issue.
That's not an issue. We'll start it right up. We'll get the paperwork done and submitted. And it could take some time, but the VA pays based upon the date of claim. So if it takes them a year, you're going to get a residual back pay of a year.
And it would take that long for the other benefit anyway.
Absolutely.
And, it would be well worth it to go down this road.
Yeah.
We don't have a whole lot of time left, but I do want to talk about the issue of post-traumatic stress. Now, with all of the conflicts that we've had, we have persons coming back with post-traumatic stress. Again, I believe it's very important that they get their symptoms and what they're actually experiencing documented by some kind of doctor, because you have to have the proof. Is that correct?
With the VA, in order to win a claim for post-traumatic stress, it requires three things. A diagnosis, which the VA will give, and they're responsible to do that. A diagnosis linked to a verifiable stressor. That means if a particular incident took place, the VA must be able to verify that emphatically and say,
that really happened.
That happened, yeah. And then they have to have symptomology, obviously, relating to how it's affecting their day-to-day living, that kind of thing. When you start looking at post-traumatic stress, every veteran potentially who served in a combat area of operation has some form of post-traumatic stress, whether it be mild, chronic, or moderate. And the VA will look at all of that. And the key thing to remember here is if a veteran has a Purple Heart, Bronze Star with V device, Silver Star, Medal of Honor recipient, things of this nature that show that they had combat. They had a combat type of MOS or whatever, or they received a combat action badge or combat ribbon. The stressor is conceded, and that veteran doesn't have to necessarily write that story down. A long time ago, they used to have to do that. The veteran doesn't have to do that. And that's such an important aspect of this filing of this claim, because the VA is going to be the one that's going to determine whether or not you have it. They're going to diagnose it, and then they're going to say, oh, you have a Purple Heart. It's going to be conceded. If you have a Purple Heart if you're a Purple Heart recipient and you're out here and you're hearing this and you haven't filed for post-traumatic stress disorder, you should do so, because it is affecting you whether you like it or not. And if you ask your spouse, and one thing that I tell people, I says you can always go on the internet and type in post-traumatic stress symptoms. And when you start to read it, or your wife is reading it, or your husband's reading it to you, you bet. You go, that's you.
Yep.
Things as simple as I sit with my back in the restaurant, to the back. Why? So I can see what's going on.
Yep.
Well, why would you do that?
And I know exactly where all the exits are.
And these are normal responses to a very traumatic event. And keeping in mind, we're not just talking about combat. This is military sexual trauma. This is you were injured, or you had some sort of horrific event that you were took part in. And one of the things we're talking about is body recovery. That
That's what I
is
was thinking,
horrendous.
Carmen.
Yeah, it's horrendous. And so when you start looking at how do you prepare for that? Well, here guys, you, come on, get in the van. And now we're going out and we're going to see this airplane crashed and we're going to recover the bodies. Recover the bodies. My goodness. What a horrible thing. But then the same thing is combat or somebody who's experienced military sexual trauma. The VA has come a long way for our women veterans. So I want to really encourage them to fight to get into the VA, and they actually have a women's clinic and everything that's set up in all of these facilities that specifically talk about military sexual trauma. We're talking about the undressing of a person with the eye. That's a sexual issue, and a lot of people are traumatized because of it. And this always, and keep in mind too, military sexual trauma doesn't only happen to women; it happens to men as well. So when we as service officers are very compassionate about these type of issues, and so when you share these kind of stories with us, we're going to encourage you to file the claim. My thing is, you file it, and then if they ask for certain evidence and you can get it to them, we're going to win.
Absolutely.
I hate losing.
Well, if someone wanted to get in contact with you, it's 208-446-1092.
Or 1090.
1090.
Yep.
And you are located over in Post Falls,
Right.
next to the license.
Yeah, we're in the same building as the Department of Motor Vehicles at 120 East Railroad Avenue in Post Falls, Idaho. And we love to have our vets come in and see us. We always have the coffee on, and there's it's a good staff.
And you're working on appointments 2 weeks out?
No,
right now?
our appointments are only a week out.
Oh, very good.
Yeah, we slowed that down quite a bit after getting Scott on board. Scott came on board in June last year as a new county
Perfect.
service officer. And so he's knocking claims out, and it's nice to see him doing that.
So we got two people
you
here
bet.
that can really help. So
Absolutely.
and there's no excuse.
There you go.
You really need to. So thank you, Darryl, for being with me this
Thanks
afternoon.
for having me, Connie.
I always love talking with you. You always teach me so much. And so for the rest of you, I hope you have a wonderful rest of your weekend. Good day.